Tchaikovsky wrote the music for the ballet, and it became an instant hit. Although, if I remember correctly, Tchaikovsky did not want to write the Nutcracker. He did not think it was a good idea. But it turned out to be one of the most classic stories and by far the most performed ballet companies across the world all do this show. It is a staple. I'm a bit of a ballet nerd. I really love ballet. It's very near and dear to me, and so is the Nutcracker. So I thought this would be a great story to read, as today, when I'm recording this, it is Christmas morning. And I want to say before we get started that you will probably hear my AC unit kick on. The unit is right outside my window, and I don't know at this time where else to set up my recording area, so I apologize. I'm going to try to figure out a way to reduce that sound, but hopefully it's not too loud. And I have my little blue box again. I used this in my last video, and I just like it. I think that's a good tapping noise. So I will probably be tapping on that throughout the video. But anyways, let's get started. This has some nice illustrations by Emma Brock. This is on the University of Pennsylvania website. This was the reason that whenever one of the clocks became ill and could not sing anymore, they sent for Godfather Drosselmeyer. He would come, remove his wig and his little yellow coat, and tying out an apron, would take out a pointed instrument and run it into the clock. This always made Marie sad, but seemed to help the clock, as it at once became alive again and began to purr branches. The most wonderful thing about the tree, however, was the hundreds of lights that sparkled like stars, and the tree seemed to invite them in a most friendly fashion to come and pluck its buds and fruits. Around the tree everything shone in bright and superb colors. What beautiful things there just next to the tree, a splendid little man became visible, standing there quietly and modestly. To be sure how much fault could be found with his body, for the trunk not only seemed much too large for the thin little legs, but the head also seemed too large. His clothes, however, covered up his defects, as these seemed to belong to a man of taste and culture. He was dressed in a glossy violet coat worn by hussars, with many white buttons and lacings, the same kind of trousers, and the handsome little boots that were ever seen on the feet of an officer. These fitted the neat little legs so closely that they seemed to be painted on them. It was comical that with this outfit he should have worn a narrow, clumsy cape that looked quite wooden, and on his head a miner's cap. Marie, in noticing this, remembered that Godfather Drosselmeyer also wore a very plain cloak and a funny cap, but still was a very dear godfather. While Marie was examining this neat little man more intently, for as she had taken a fancy to him at her first glance, she became more and more aware of what a good-natured expression his face had. From his light green eyes, a little too large, belongs as much to me as to you, so give him to me." Marie began to cry violently and quickly wrapped the sick Nutcracker in her little handkerchief. The parents came forward with Godfather Drosselmeyer. "I have expressly placed the Nutcracker under Marie's protection," said the father, "and as I see that he needs it very much at this time, she shall have full power without anyone else having anything to say about it." I am much astonished at Fritz that he should require further service from someone who became ill while serving him. He ought to know that one never places a wounded soldier in rank and file. Fritz was much ashamed, and without paying any more attention to Nuts or the Nutcracker, crept over to the other side of the table where his hussars, after posting strong sentinels on guard, had moved into their night quarters. Marie gathered up Nutcracker's lost teeth, and around his injured chin she tied a pretty white ribbon, which she had unfastened from her dress. Then she wrapped him even more carefully into her handkerchief, as he seemed to look pale and frightened. Thus she rocked him in her arms as if he were a small child, and looked at the beautiful pictures in the new picture book, which was among the many other gifts received today. Magic. In the Stahlbaum's living room, just as one entered the door on the left wall, stood a high cupboard in which the children kept all the pretty things which were given to them each year. Their father had this cupboard made by a very skilled cabinet maker, who had used such clear glass and had arranged everything in it so cleverly that all the gifts looked brighter and lovelier in it than when one held them in one's hands. On the upper shelf, inaccessible to Marie and Fritz, stood Godfather Drosselmeyer's mechanical toys, and the shelf just below it contained their picture books. The two lower shelves Fritz and Marie used for whatever they wanted. It usually happened, however, that Marie used the lower space as a home for her dolls, while Fritz used the shelf above it as barracks for his soldiers. That was what had happened today, also, for while Fritz was setting up his hussars above, Marie had taken out Mamselle Trudchen, and had moved the new, beautifully dressed doll into the well-furnished rooms, and had invited herself to tea and cakes. Here's Marie looking at her picture book with the injured Nutcracker in her lap. You can see the white bow around his jaw. I like how the story has changed just slightly in details over time. I know in the Barbie Nutcracker movie, he breaks his arm, and they have to put it in a little sling. And in my local production of the Nutcracker, his whole head pops off, and they have to tie it around his neck to keep his head on. The room was certainly well furnished, and any other child would have been happy to possess such a little flowered sofa, such charming little chairs, such a dear tea table, and above all such a bright brass bed in which the most beautiful dolls could rest. All of this stood in the corner of the cupboard, the walls of which were papered with gray-colored pictures. In this room, the new doll, whose name was Mamselle Clargen, could feel much at home. It was almost midnight, and Godfather Drosselmeyer had been gone. Mouse King's ears can hear. Whir, whir, whir. Sing him the songs of yore, for soon he will be no more. Strike, clock, strike. And bum, 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 it struck with a muffled and hollow sound 12 times. Marie, now badly scared, was about to run away when she saw Godfather Drosselmeyer sitting on the clock instead of the owl, with his yellow coattails like wings hanging down. When she saw Godfather Drosselmeyer sitting on the clock instead of the owl, with his yellow coattails like wings hanging down on either side, she called in a crying voice, Godfather Drosselmeyer, Godfather Drosselmeyer, what are you doing up there? Come on down and do not frighten me, you bad Godfather. Just then, furious giggling and whistling started all around her, and it seemed to her as if 1,000 little feet were trotting and running in the walls, and 1,000 little lights were looking through the cracks in the floor. But they were not lights. No, they were sparkling little eyes. And Marie became aware that everywhere mice were peeping out and pushing themselves forward. Very soon she heard trot, 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 hop, 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 and more mice galloped around and at last took positions in distinct rows, just as Fritz's soldiers did when they were ready to go into battle. Marie thought this was very funny, and as she was not afraid of mice, her timidity left her, said Marie. "Those are my little chimes." And as she moved to one side, she saw strange lights and caught glimpses of all the dolls running around, waving their arms excitedly. All at once, Mr. Nutcracker arose, threw the blanket away, and jumped out of bed with both feet at once, calling loudly, "Crack, crack, crack! seemed to produce more troops right along, and the little silver bills which they hurled so skillfully could be heard as they struck the glass of the cabinet. Then burr, burr, puff, boom, boom, rip, rip, rap, and all the mice in the Mouse King squeaked and screeched, and above it all one could hear Nutcracker's mighty pleasant surprise. When Marie awoke from her deep sleep, she was lying in her bed, and the bright sun shone through the ice-covered panes of the windows. Close beside her sat a strange man, whom she soon recognized as Dr. Wendelstern. In a low voice he whispered, "Now she is awake." Then Marie's mother came in and looked at her with an anxious, searching glance. "Oh, mother dear," whispered Marie, "are all those horrid mice gone, and was the good Nutcracker rescued?" Marie's mother remained serious and asked the judge what he meant by such antics. The judge laughingly replied, "Have you entirely forgotten my clock song? I always sing it to patients like Marie." With this, he sat down close to Marie's bed and said, "Do not be angry with me that I didn't at once put out the 14 eyes of the Mouse King. It couldn't be done. Instead, I will give you a pleasant surprise." With these words, he reached into his pocket and slowly pulled out the Nutcracker, whose teeth and jaw he had set back into place. Marie chuckled for joy, but her mother smiled and said, "Now do you see how much Godfather Drosselmeyer thinks of your Nutcracker? You must confess, however," the judge interrupted Mrs. Stahlbaum, "that the Nutcracker's body could be improved upon, and that his face can hardly be called handsome. How such a lack of beauty came into his family and was handed down from one generation to another, I will tell you, if you wish to hear the story. Perhaps Marie knows the story of the Princess Berlibat, the witch Mouse Rings, and the skillful watchmaker." "Listen to me," called Fritz at this instant. "Godfather Drosselmeyer, you really inserted the teeth of the Nutcracker, and his jaw isn't as shaky as it was either. But why has he no sword? Why didn't you fasten one to his belt?" "Oh," replied the judge rather impatiently, "you always have to find fault and criticize, boy. What concern of mine is Nutcracker's sword? I have cured his body. He can himself see where he finds a sword." "That is true," replied Fritz. "If he amounts to anything, he will see to it that he gets some weapons. Well, Marie," the judge continued, "tell me, do you know the story of Princess voice whisper, "Give me some of the pork sausage, sister. I want to feast also. I too am a queen. Give me some pork." The queen knew at once that it was Mrs. Mouse Rings, the Mouse Queen, who was speaking. Mrs. Mouse Rings had been living in the palace many years. She declared that she was related to the royal family and that she was queen of mousedom and had a large household under the hearth. The queen was a good and generous woman, and while she did not wish to acknowledge Mrs. Mouse Rings as queen and sister, she was glad to bestow some of the pork on this day of feasting, and replied, "Come out, Mrs. Mouse Rings, and I will give you some of my pork." There's the queen making the sausage, and there's the little mouse queen. That's cute how they have matching crowns on. Then Mrs. Mouse Rings leapt merrily onto the hearth, and taking the squares of pork very daintily into her little paws, ate one after the other as the queen gave them to her. But all at once Mrs. Mouse Rings' aunts, uncles, and cousins came forward, as well as her 7 sons, who were naughty rascals, and jumped into the pork, so that the queen could not defend herself, and was much frightened. That's my cat banging his head on the desk. He wants to be held. Luckily, the Lord High Stewardess just then appeared and chased away the unwelcome guests, so that there was a little pork left. This the court mathematician, who was called for the purpose, divided very artfully into all of the sausages. Drums and trumpets sounded, and the princes and dukes came to feast in gala attire, some on white horses, others in crystal coaches. The king received them with the greatest cordiality and graciousness, and then, clad in crown and scepter, took his place as sovereign at the head of the table. When the liver sausage was presented, however, one could see how very much disappointed the king was, for he became paler and paler. He lifted his eyes to heaven. He sighed and sighed as if he had severe pain. Here's him crying over not having enough sausages. When the blood sausage came, however, he sank, sobbing and crying, into the back of his armchair, put both hands before his face, and moaned and lamented. Everyone rose from the table, mind, namely Christian Elias Drosselmeyer, promised to rid the palace forever of Mrs. Mouserings and her family through a very clever device. He found very artful little machines in which he fastened bacon with a thread, which Mr. Drosselmeyer placed all around the residence of Mrs. Bacon-Eater. But Mrs. Mouserings was much too wise not to see her danger in this plan. In spite of all her warning and pleading, not being able to resist the sweet smell of fried bacon, her 7 sons, as well as many of her relatives, went into the little machines. Just when they were beginning to nibble at the bacon, they were caught in a little wire prison and taken to the kitchen to be cruelly executed. Mrs. Mouserings left this region of horror with her little retinue. I've never heard that word. Sorrow, despair, and revenge filled her breast. The court was overjoyed, but the queen was greatly troubled, for she knew the disposition of Mrs. Mouserings, and knew that she would have revenge for the death of her sons and her relatives. In fact, just when the queen was preparing a special dish for the king, Mrs. Mouserings appeared to the queen and said, "My sons, my cousins, and my relatives have all been killed. Be careful, Madam Queen, that the Mouse Queen does not bite your little princess to pieces. Be very careful." The queen became so terror-stricken that she burned the favorite dish she was preparing for the king, thus for a second time making the king angry. But this is all of the story tonight. Next time, more. No matter how much Marie, who had her own ideas about the story, begged him to continue, Godfather Drosselmeyer could not be persuaded to continue, but arising said, "Too much of anything is poor policy. Tomorrow we will continue." Just as he was passing through the door, Fritz called, "Tell me, Godfather, is it really true that you invented the mouse traps?" "Why do you ask such foolish questions?" called his mother. But the judge smiled and replied, "Am I not a skillful watchmaker, and could I not then invent a mousetrap?" Here's a continuation of the fairy tale of the Hard Nut. This kind of reminds me of Princess Bride when the grandfather is reading the book to his sick grandson, and they keep interrupting to have a conversation in the real world, and then we go back to the princess world. "Now you know full well, children," continued the judge the next evening, "why the queen was guarding the beautiful Princess Brillipat so carefully. Must she not live in constant fear that Mrs. Mouserings would carry out her threat reason he gave command that if Drosselmeyer could not, within 4 weeks, restore the princess to her former condition, or at least to find a way in which this could be accomplished, he would have him put to death by the disgraceful way of the executioner's axe. Drosselmeyer, though much alarmed, sought aid in his art and his good fortune, and began his first operation, which he deemed most necessary. He took the princess all apart, unscrewed her hands and feet, and viewed the inner structure of her body, and there, to his sorrow, he found that the older little Pirlipat would become, the more ungainly she would appear. Now he was at his wit's end, for what to do he did not know. He very carefully put the princess together again, and sank down heart-sick near her cradle, which he had been forbidden to leave. Four weeks had already gone by. Yes, it was Wednesday when the king, with angry eyes, looked into the room and proclaimed threateningly, waving his scepter, "Christian Elias Drosselmeyer, if you do not find a remedy for the princess, you must die." Drosselmeyer wept bitterly, but Princess Pirlipat contentedly cracked nuts. It was the first time that the clockmaker had noted Pirlipat's unusual appetite for nuts, and in particular he noted the teeth with which she had been born. In fact, directly after her change, she had cried incessantly until a nut was given to her. This she cracked, ate the kernel of it, and then became quiet. "Oh, wise sign of nature," cried Christian Elias, "you show me the gate to this secret. I will knock and you will open." He at once begged permission to have an interview with the court astronomer, and was led to him in care of his guards. Both men embraced with tears in their eyes, as they had become firm friends. They entered a private room and began to read book after book, dealing with many mysteries. Night overtook them, and the court astronomer looked at the stars, and began with the help of Mr. Drosselmeyer, who also understood the art, to cast the horoscope of Princess Pirlipat. It was most difficult, but at last, what joy! It was clearly to be seen that in order to break the spell of the enchantment which had made her so ugly and deformed, and bring back her former beauty, it was only necessary that she should eat the sweet kernel of a Crackatuck nut. Here's them crafting the horoscope. A Crackatuck nut has such a hard shell that a 48-pound cannon could drive over it without cracking it. This hard nut must be cracked by a man who had never been shaved. delicious dinner and was in a good humor, and therefore ready to listen to the entreaties of the Queen on Drosselmeyer's behalf. She took courage to inform the king that Drosselmeyer's problem had been to find the remedy, and that he had accomplished this. The king said he called this quibbling, and at last concluded that the clockmaker and astronomer were to go forth at once and return with the Nutcracker in their possession. The man to crack the nut was to be procured by advertising in various papers, both at home and abroad. Here the judge refused to go on with the story, but promised to conclude it the next evening. Conclusion of the fairy tale of the hard nut. The next evening, as soon as the candles had been lighted, the judge continued his story. The clockmaker and astronomer had been away 15 years without finding a trace of the Nutcracker, where they had been and what curious things had happened to them. I could talk about for weeks, but I shall not do so. I shall state at once that Drosselmeyer in his sorrow now had a great longing to return to his native city of Nuremberg. This longing came over him when he and his friends were in a deep jungle in Asia, smoking a good pipe of tobacco. Oh, my beautiful, beautiful native city of Nuremberg, beautiful was rather queer, but finding such a piece of money in my pocket, I bought the nut and gilded it, not knowing really why I had paid so much for it. There was no doubt about the cousin's nut being the long-sought Crackatuck nut, especially when the court astronomer who had been called scraped the gold from the nut, and there found the name carved in the shell in Chinese letters. The joy of the travelers was unbounded, and the cousin was the happiest man under the sun. Drosselmeyer assured him that his fortune was made, and in addition to a pension, he would see to it that he would in the future receive, of charge, all the gold he needed for gilding. The travelers had already donned their nightcaps and were going to bed when the astronomer said, "My dear comrade, luck never comes singly, and I believe that we have not only found the Nutcracker, but also the young man who shall crack it with his teeth and present the beautifying kernel to the princess. I mean the son of your cousin. No, I cannot sleep," he continued, much excited, "but shall at once this night cast the young man's horoscope." With that, he removed his nightcap and at once began his search. The cousin's son was, to be sure, a tall, well-built young man who had never been shaved and never worn boots. It was true that for several years during Christmas time he had been a puppet, but no one would have been able to detect this in the least. He had been educated through his father's efforts. At Christmas time he wore a handsome red coat with gold braid, carried a sword, his hat under his arm, and had his hair dressed after the latest fashion with a hairnet. Thus he appeared very handsome in his father's booth and cracked nuts for the young girls. That's why they called him Little Nutcracker. The next morning the astronomer embraced his friend and called with joy, "He is the one. We have found him. Only we must pay attention to two things. First and foremost, you must prepare for your admirable nephew a stout wooden braid of hair, which is so connected with the lower jaw that he can receive a sharp jerk with it. Secondly, we must keep it a secret in the town that we have brought the young man with us who can crack the Crackatuck nut. In fact, it must appear as if he arrived much later. I am reading in the horoscope that if a number of men break their teeth in trying to crack the nut without success, the king will give as a reward to the young man who succeeds and thus restores her, the princess herself, in marriage, and will name the young man as his successor. The tall carver was highly pleased with the idea that his son should marry the Princess Brilibet and become prince and king, and therefore gave the matter entirely into the keeping of the travelers. The braid of hair which Drosselmeyer had very successfully attached to the promising young nephew was working admirably, as with it he had been able to crack with his teeth any number of the hardest peach stones. As Drosselmeyer and the astronomer had this was not to remain unpunished, for young Drosselmeyer had stepped on her neck so severely with the sharp heel of his shoes that she was mortally wounded. When Mrs. Mouserings was about to die, she squeaked out, "Oh, Crackatuck, hard nut, from which I now must die. Nutcracker soon will pass away. My son with the 7 crowns will repay, and avenge his mother. O life so full of joy, from you I must depart. O peril of death." Squeak. With this cry, Mrs. Mouserings departed this life, and was taken away by the king's official stove tender. No one had paid attention to young Drosselmeyer, but the princess reminded the king of his promise, and he at once gave orders to have the young hero appear on the scene. When, however, the unfortunate man with his deformity stepped forward, the princess covered both her eyes and said, "Away, away with that ugly Nutcracker." And soon the court-martial took hold of him by his little shoulders and pushed him through the door. The king was furious that he should have been expected to have a Nutcracker for a son-in-law. He blamed it all upon the stupidity of the clockmaker and astronomer, and had them expelled from the court. The horoscope which the astronomer had cast in Nuremberg had not shown this, but he was determined to seek further happenings in the stars, and he claimed to find that the young Drosselmeyer would behave so well in his new environment that in spite of his deformity, he would become prince and king. His misshapen body could disappear only when the 7-headed son of Mrs. Mouserings, who was now the Mouse King, should be killed by him, and when a lady should love him in spite of his deformity. We are told that it came to pass that young Drosselmeyer was seen at Christmas time in his father's booth as Nutcracker, but also was seen as a prince. That is the fairy tale of the hard nut, and now you know why so many people say that was a hard nut to crack, and why nutcrackers are usually so ugly. And thus the judge closed his story. Marie thought that the Princess Berlibat was unkind and ungrateful, but Fritz assured her that if the Nutcracker was as brave as he pretended to be, he would conquer the Mouse King and thus soon regain his former fine figure. In a week's time, Marie was well again and could dance around the room as usual. made certain of this when she listened to the story. "But why didn't your uncle help you?" Marie asked, as she became more and more impressed with the idea that the battle she had witnessed was to save the kingdom and the crown of the Nutcracker. Had she not seen that all the other dolls were subjects, and was it not in fact that the prophecy of the court astronomer had been fulfilled, and young Mr. Drosselmeyer had become king of the dolls? During the time that clever Marie was turning this over in her mind, she believed that the Nutcracker and his vassals must really come to life and begin to move. But this was not the case. Everything in the cupboard remained quiet and motionless. Marie, however, unwilling to give up her idea, was convinced that this was due to the evil spell cast upon them by Mrs. Mouserings and her seven-headed son. Out loud she said, "Even if you are not able to move or speak to me, dear Mr. Drosselmeyer, I know that you understand how good my intentions are. You may count on my assistance whenever you need it. At least I shall ask your uncle to help you with this skill, should it be necessary." The Nutcracker remained quiet, but to Marie it seemed as if a sigh, which seemed to resound from the panes of glass, could be heard throughout the cupboard. It was twilight when Marie's father and Judge Drosselmeyer made their appearance. In a short time, Louise had the tea table ready, and the family gathered around it, each having something amusing to tell. Marie had brought her little easy chair and seated herself beside of Godfather Drosselmeyer. Just when there was a moment of silence, Marie looked up at the judge with her large blue eyes and said, "I am now convinced, dear Godfather, that my Nutcracker is your nephew, the young Mr. Drosselmeyer from Nuremberg. He is a prince, or rather a king, as was foretold by your companion, the astronomer. But you know he is at open war with the son of Mrs. Mouserings, the mean Mouse King. Why don't you help him?" Marie now repeated the entire details of the battle as she had witnessed it, and was often interrupted by the loud laughter of her mother she saw the Mouse King push himself through a hole in the floor and run about the room with his 7 pairs of sparkling eyes and his 7 crowns. With one leap, he jumped on the table that stood beside Marie's bed and said, "Hi, hi, hi, give me your sugar plums, your marzipan, little girl, or else I will bite your nutcracker, your nutcracker." So hissed the Mouse King, showing his teeth. Then he jumped down and ran into the hole. Marie was so frightened at the ugly apparition that she was quite pale the next morning and was so excited that she could hardly talk. Over and over again she thought she would tell her mother Louise, or at least Fritz, what had happened to her. But she always decided, they will not believe me and will only laugh at me. It was very clear to her, however, that if she wished to save the nutcracker, she would have to sacrifice her sugar plums and marzipan. All she had of these she therefore laid on the ledge of the cupboard. In the morning her mother called her and said, "I cannot understand how it is we have mice in our living room now. Just see, Marie, they have eaten all your candy." It was really so. All the candy was gone except a few pieces, for which the greedy Mouse King evidently did not care. Marie did not grieve about this, however, and she was overjoyed at believing she had saved her nutcracker. But lo and behold, the following night, close to her ear, there was the same As soon as Marie found herself alone in the living room, she went at once to the cupboard and sobbing said, "Oh, my dear Mr. Drosselmeyer, what can a poor unhappy girl do for you? Even if I give my picture books and my very pretty dresses which Santa brought me for the Mouse King to gnaw on, will he not at last want me and bite me? What shall I do now? What shall I do?" When Marie was thus lamenting, she noticed that a spot of blood had remained on the neck of the Nutcracker since that eventful night. She took him carefully from the shelf and began to rub the spot with her handkerchief. But she could hardly believe her senses, for when she was rubbing, she felt the Nutcracker coming to life in her hand. Quickly she returned him to the shelf, and then his little mouth quivered and he whispered, "My dear Marie, loyal friend, how much I owe to you. No picture book nor Christmas dresses shall you sacrifice for me. Just produce a sword, and leave the rest to me." Here he became speechless, and his sad, expressive eyes were again lifeless. Marie was no longer afraid. In fact, she was overjoyed, for now she knew a remedy that would help the Nutcracker without any more painful sacrifices on her part. But where should she get a sword for the little fellow? Marie decided to confide in Fritz, and as their parents were away and they were alone in the living room, she again told him the whole story and asked his advice about saving the Nutcracker. "As far as the sword is concerned, I can help the Nutcracker, for I retired an old colonel with pension a few days ago, and he will have no more use for his beautiful sharp sword." Fritz at once brought forth the colonel from the corner of the third shelf, where he was apparently enjoying his pension, relieved him of his silver sword, and fastened it on the Nutcracker. Here's Marie with her Nutcracker come to life. Also, I'm sorry if you hear the trucks outside getting the garbage cans. They're being very loud. Being much afraid, Marie could not go to sleep the following night. About midnight, she thought she heard queer noises in the living which were usually securely locked, stood open, and she could distinctly see her father's traveling fox furs hanging in front. Nutcracker climbed very skillfully up on the ledge and onto the molding in order to reach the large tassel which was fastened to a heavy cord on the back of the fur coat. When Nutcracker gave a jerk on the tassel, a dainty flight of cedar wood steps came down through the sleeve. "Will you be good enough to go up?" called Nutcracker. Here's them, going up a little staircase in the sleeve of her father's coat. Just very odd. It didn't say that Marie shrunk down, but I guess it's kind of like Narnia, where it just happens and you don't question how. "Will you be good enough to go up?" called Nutcracker. Marie did as she was asked, but had hardly gone through the sleeve and looked out the collar when a blinding light met her view, and she found herself in the center of a meadow, heavy with fragrance, from which millions of sparks were shining forth like glittering diamonds. "We are now in the Candy Meadow," said Nutcracker, "but we shall soon pass out through that gateway." Now Marie became aware of a beautiful gate arising a few steps from them in the meadow. It seemed to be built of white, brown, and pink speckled marble, but when she came nearer she saw that the entire mass was baked out of sugar, almonds, and raisins. For this reason, Nutcracker explained, it was known as the Almond Raisin Gate. On a protruding gallery of this gate, seemingly of barley sugar, 6 little monkeys in red waistcoats were producing beautiful music. Soon Marie was surrounded by the most delicious fragrance which came from a nearby forest. In the dark foliage there was so much that was sparkling and glistening that one could see quite distinctly gold and silver fruit hanging on brightly colored stems. The trunks and branches were adorned with ribbons and flowers like a bridal couple and their merry guests. And when the orange perfume floated like waves, the branches and leaves murmured, the tinsel crackled and rustled like joyful music to the accompaniment of which the sparkling lights were skipping and dancing. "Oh, how is the Orange Brook, said Nutcracker when questioned. Except for its fragrance, it does not compare with the Lemonade River, which, like it, flows into Almond Milk Lake. In fact, Marie soon heard a louder splashing and rippling, and saw the broad Lemonade River proudly threading its course in cream-colored waves through the green, glowing shrubbery. A refreshing, cool air which strengthened chest and heart arose from this water. Not far away, a slow, dark, yellow stream was quietly wending its fragrant way. On its shores, pretty little children were catching plump fish, which they ate at once. In the distance on this river, Marie could see an imposing village. Houses, churches, barns were all dark brown, covered with golden roofs, and many walls were so colorfully decorated that it looked as if colored candies had been used in their construction. That is Sugar Cookie Village, said Nutcracker, which lies on Honey River. The people living there are very handsome, but they are usually cross, for they suffer from toothache, and for that reason we will not stop there at present. Just then Marie noticed a little city with gaily colored, transparent houses, which looked very attractive. Nutcracker went toward it, and Marie heard a hilarious noise and saw thousands of neat little people unpacking high, loaded wagons in the marketplace. The cargo looked like bright colored paper and slabs of chocolate. We are in Bonbonville, said Nutcracker, and cargo has just arrived from Paperland and from the Chocolate King. The poor Bonbon houses were in great danger lately, as they were attacked by an army of gnats, and that is the reason they are now covering their houses with the gifts from Paperland and building trenches supported by slabs from the Chocolate King. But, dear Fräulein Stahlbaum, we must not loiter in these villages, but visit waves splashed higher, and in the distance Marie saw a gaily colored, opalescent shell wagon, sparkling with all sorts of gems, and drawn by 2 dolphins with golden scales. 12 little boys with caps and aprons woven from the feathers of hummingbirds leaped to the shore and carried first Marie and then the Nutcracker over the waves into the wagon, which then glided over the lake. Oh, how glorious it was to ride in this shell wagon, surrounded by rose perfume and rosy waves. The 2 gold-scaled dolphins lifted their nostrils and gushed forth into the air crystal jets of water. As these fell in rainbow colors, one could hear 2 silver-toned voices saying, "Who swims on the lake so airy? The fairy, the fairy. Bim, bim, little fishes, swim, swim. Swans move and sing, and the fairies bring rosy waves, dash, clash, flash, ever on." The 12 little pages who had jumped on the back of the shell wagon seemed to resent the song of the water, for they shook their parasols so violently that the date leaves from which they were made crackled and spluttered. With that they stamped their feet and sang, click, clack, forward and back. Little dancers cannot be slack. Fishes and swans, bestir yourself. Drone, shell wagon, drone, click, clack, forward and back. There they are on the shell wagon crossing the lake. "These boys are very merry people," said Nutcracker, "but if they keep on, they will drive the whole lake into rebellion." It was true, for soon one could hear a deafening noise of wonderful voices coming from the air and water. Marie was not disturbed, however, as she saw only charming girls' faces smiling at her from the waves. "Oh," she cried, clapping her hands, "oh, look, dear Drosselmeyer, there is Princess Perlipat smiling at me. Oh, look, look." Nutcracker, however, sighed rather sadly and said, "That is not Princess Perlipat. That is yourself, always your own face, that smiles from each rosy wave." In that moment, the 12 pages picked her up and carried her to the shore. She found herself in a green thicket, which seemed even more wonderful than the Christmas forest, for everything sparkled and glistened. Especially marvelous were the rare fruits of the strangest color and fragrance hanging on the trees. "We are in the confetti grove," said Nutcracker, "and over there is the capital." What did Marie see? Not only were the walls and towers gay-colored, but the shape of the buildings was different from anything she had seen on earth. Instead of roofs, these houses had dainty braided crowns, and the towers were decorated with the most delicate foliage she had ever seen. As she passed through the gateway, which looked as if it were built of macarons and candied fruit, silver soldiers stood at attention, and one little man in a brocaded dressing gown threw his arms around Nutcracker's neck with the words, "Welcome, dear Prince, welcome to Confectionville." Marie was rather astonished as it is believed that with them one can make anything one wants of any person. The little merry people are so afraid of this power that the mere mention of the word will quiet the greatest tumult, I'm not sure, which the mayor has just proven to you. No one then thinks of anything earthly, of the blow in his side or of a black eye, but turns his thoughts inwards and says, what is man and what can be made of him? Marie could not refrain from a loud exclamation of wonder, for she stood before a palace with 100 towers, all lit with crimson glowing lights. Here and there on the walls were large bouquets of violets, narcissus, tulips, and stalks, and the rich colors of which enhanced the white of the building with their pink glow. The large dome of the center building, as well as the pyramid-shaped towers, was strewn with thousands of sparkling gold and silver stars. Now we are before the Marzipan Castle, said Nutcracker. Marie was speechless before this enchanted palace, but she noticed that the roof of one of the large towers was entirely missing, and that little man, standing on a scaffold of cinnamon sticks, were trying to restore it. Before Marie could ask for an explanation, the Nutcracker continued. A short time ago, this palace was threatened with the wicked devastation, if not with entire destruction. The giant Sweet Tooth came this way and quickly bit into the roof of yonder tower and was nibbling on the dome when the citizens of this city bought him off by giving him, as a tribute, an entire quarter of the city as well as part of the grove. This satisfied his appetite, and he went on. At this moment, one could hear soft, low music. At this moment, one could hear soft, low music, and the doors of the palace were opened, and 12 pages came out carrying torches of stems of cloves in their little hands. Their heads consisted of one pearl, the body of rubies and emeralds, and they walked on feet made of pure gold. They were followed by 4 ladies about the size of Marie's new doll, but so exquisitely dressed that Marie knew at once they must be princesses. They embraced Nutcracker most affectionately and cried in a sad voice, "Oh, my prince, my dear prince, oh, my brother." Nutcracker seemed elated but sad, for he wiped the tears from his eyes, took hold of Marie's hand, and spoke in a formal manner. "This is Fraulein Marie Stahlbaum, who saved my life, the daughter of a very honorable physician. If she had not thrown her slipper at the right time and procured for me the sword of the retired colonel, I would by this time be in my grave, bitten to pieces by that cursed Mouse King." Turning to Marie, they cried, "Oh, you are she was wishing that she too might help. The most beautiful of Nutcracker's sisters, as if reading her thoughts, handed her a gold mortar with the words, "Oh dear friend, beloved, deliverer of my brother, pound a little of this loaf sugar." Here's Marie meeting the princesses. as is this one of the Nutcracker and the Mouse King. And that is the end of the story. But thank you for joining me. This was my first time doing a longer story, and it's been a bit challenging, but I hope to get better at doing longer videos, and I hope you enjoyed this. I'll see